Some December Tynwald leftovers to dig into on agenda this evening. We'll hear later some opposing views on Stu Peters' attempt to persuade government to revisit its net zero targets and budgets. But first, the new chair of the Public Services Commission has agreed a timetable to publish the Commission's overdue annual reports. Mr Hooper had a motion down in December Tynwald calling for the reports to be published, and Rob Collister had an amendment. You had an amendment which basically said, you pretty much agree that these things should have been produced, and you've set out a timetable in your amendment, which was supported. But there were some quite extraordinary comments from the outgoing chair of the Public Service Commission.
Yeah, from my point of view is I had actually spoke to Mr Hooper. I'd made it very clear to him that I could possibly get the 22 and 23 reports out. But I also explained to him that the 24 report hadn't even started to be drafted. So I was a very clear, open conversation. He was happy to support my amendment, and I'm grateful for that. I think from a Public Service Commission point of view is this does open up the wider topic around how the actual Public Service Commission is being managed and financed at the moment, because we simply do not have any dedicated resources or even budget or staff. So this is something that will be presented to the Chief Minister in the first consolidated report, that maybe we do need some resources and maybe we do need some finance and staff to help us, because at the moment we are basically having to beg, borrow and steal from within the Cabinet Office, even though we do have some secretarial support and we do have support from the head of OHR, which is the human resources element. So there is support there, but we don't have designated support that the board needs.
And that's quite an extraordinary thing to hear, bearing in mind the Public Service Commission effectively is the employer of the vast majority of people who work for government.
Yeah, technically, the Public Service Commission is responsible for around 4,000 civil servants. Now, there are additional staff to that, but these the ones that actually sit within the Public Service Commission and the civil servants is around 4,000. Now, what we need to do is over the next few months is to actually look at this. How do we actually resource the facility and the service correctly, get the right support in there, get the right secretarial support? And I do want to put on record my sincere thanks to the officers within the Cabinet Office that have stepped forward to provide the support that the committee needs, on top of their already difficult roles they're undertaken. So I'm hoping when the Chief Minister does get the final report or the consolidated report for 22 and 23, he will think about that and actually correctly resource the facility in order for us to provide the service that the public service needs, and for enable us to actually implement the improvements that the public are asking us to implement in the next 2 years of this administration.
That was Onken MHK Rob Collister. Glenn Faber and Peel MHK Kate Lord-Brennan recently stepped down as Public Services Commission Chair, and we'll get on to that shortly. But first, why did she second Stu Peters' call to review net zero targets?
Well, actually, the motion submitted to Tynwald was completely reasonable. There are huge obligations put on government and the public sector in terms of process, reporting, targets in the Climate Change Act that was really passed at the end of the administration. So, Mr Peters, your challenge to government and Tynwald really was saying, let's review these targets and let's review the budget attached to climate change, which for me seemed perfectly reasonable to do that. I'd come from a position, though, where I'd said, look, I am someone who believes in a sustainable future for the island. I think we do ultimately need to have clean energy, but also I believe in a just transition and energy security. And I think it's quite right that where law can actually put the government in a bind and is maybe not taking the island where it really needs to go because it's effectively busy work and bureaucracy, then the right thing to do is to look at that and just to reappraise that.
We heard from Daphne Kane. She acknowledged that perhaps the public aren't as fully on board on this particular net zero journey as she and others in Tynwald would like. Why do you think it is that the public, or well, perhaps the question is, do you think that the public are on board with the government's net zero ambition? And if they're not, why not?
Well, I think you need to be careful that there isn't a detachment between the things that are required to be pursued by government, particularly where they're in legislation, and actually where the public sentiment is. Because I think that it's understandable that you would want action to do many of the things Tynwald members described, to reduce emissions, have buildings that are up to scratch, make for cheaper, cleaner energy that's sustainable in the long term. Those are all specific actions. And I guess my point was, the fact is, government is being required to do many things at a bureaucratic level that is requiring officer input, development, time, thought, reflection, reporting back, that's not actually doing anything to do with climate action. And it was interesting to explore the background of the bill on that. And I did actually foresee some of this in Legislative Council. And you'll know, Phil, that when you get a bill that's sometimes referred to as a draft bill now, it's written on green paper. And I did say at the time in that sitting, when it was under our scrutiny, because this is a bill that is 48 pages. And, the big idea was this was going to help us solve and address climate change. Well, sometimes it needs a different approach to that. And I did say the only thing green about this bill is the paper it's written on. Sometimes things need to be reconnected back to the public and dealt with in a different way rather than just legislation and bureaucracy. And that was really my point.
Daphne Kane again suggested that there's been a huge amount of evidence gathering, and this is what's held things up because so little had been done in the past. As one of the former ministers involved in preparing some of the stuff in relation to a more sustainable future for the island, I probably would disagree with Mrs. Kane. But is that part of the issue here, that there's a huge amount of work that has to be done before you can actually start making the real changes that will improve people's lives, that people will then recognise and say, actually, yeah, this is working for me?
Well, I think that really comes down to political determination. And actually in this administration, there's been a number of things that have been done that will be relevant to climate change and environmental improvement. For example, there was the concerted decision to bring forward legislation against single-use plastics. DEFRA started monitoring air quality again. That's really positive. There's been the point around, basically preventing or banning fossil fuel boilers being in new builds for the future. So that already happens elsewhere. And there's been the first serious approach for renewable energy that there has ever been. I can tell you that each one of those decisions has been approached out of a political will and a determination. But amongst all of that, there is a whole layers and layers of work and things that move forward in terms of creeping obligations that are not really materially dealing with the challenges. So I had mentioned, the public duties regulations that fall under the Climate Change Act that are actually spanning out into whole other ranges of activity and policy in the name of climate change. Now, maybe theoretically that initially feels okay, but when you're also talking about the size of government, the democratic link back to things that matter, it just doesn't really feel right. And then, of course, everybody goes, oh, well, we have to do these things because it's in the legislation. I think I have felt for a while that the obligations in that legislation should actually really be reviewed for the benefit of governments in the future so that hands are not tied. And ultimately, I think there will be a greater public demand to see that over time in lots of different places, because legislation is not always the answer. It doesn't always solve everything.
Moving on then to the Public Service Commission, you've recently vacated the role as chair of the Public Services Commission. And Mr. Hooper had a motion down seeking to understand why the last 3 years of reports from the PSC hadn't been published. You were not best pleased with Mr. Hooper.
Well, I'm afraid that after a while, the approach from Mr. Hooper can become quite tiresome and wearing. And I felt on this occasion, I did have to, point out some of the kind of hypocrisy and double standards when he was talking about meeting legal and statutory requirements. I'd already given account of myself to the House of Keys at length a few weeks ago and explained why it had not been practicable to bring the reports forward. That's the key word in the law, and of course you heard the Attorney General explain that today. Now, Phil, for me, I have approached the role as of Chair of the PSC in quite a serious way, probably also because I do have a background in corporate governance, and so it's quite readily apparent to me, when things are not particularly, working well in the best interests of governance. The reports have been late. I had also given statements to Tynwald, given a full account of myself to the House of Keys. The important thing, Phil, is that the reports have needed to change, because what desperately needs to be improved within the public service, and part of what I've been working on, is actually improved accountability, the need, and the report will emphasise the need to have proper management training throughout relevant levels within government. It will also make it to be a requirement to have public service reminded of civil service regulations and financial regulations, a whole ream of stuff that has not really been broached before in terms of Public Service Commission reporting, which has typically been, it's not been that exciting, right? So the things that we're hearing all the furore over now has been, things to do with sickness absence and things like that. I'm saying that there needs to be much more serious content in the Public Services report, and the Commission have supported me in that. I've put the work in to include that. So for the report that will come out for the periods during my tenure as chair, it will point out the things that have changed to do with accountability at the very top of the civil service, which when I came into this, and I explained this in Tynwald today, around the top role in the civil service, the role of the Chief Secretary, there was very little accountability. There was no accountability between the chief officers of each department and that top role. And in effect, that meant that there was a system of accountability that was not there, and it was broken. So that's been fixed, and I'm happy to have been able to make those changes. Prior to that, you really had a system where all roads led to the one power source at the top of the civil service, which again doesn't feel comfortable for any significant powerful role. So I really wanted to use the report, and granted there has been a delay, but to explain my observations on becoming chair, the issues as I see them, and actually some of the requirements that I believe must be followed through to make for a fit for purpose, more accountable public service organisation for the future, and also one that is ready well, at least the Commission is ready to respond to the needs potentially to reform government, or indeed respond to efficiencies or restructuring changes that, are certainly efficiencies agenda is absolutely on the horizon for government. So I have been under a lot of pressure from Mr. Hooper on this. He has been absolutely relentless week by week. I have taken the role seriously, but when the report is out, which is probably will be out next week, Phil, and hopefully all of this draws a little bit more attention to the things that have been going on and the work that has been undergone. But I did have to fight my corner today, and it's for good reason that I've approached things as I have with the reports and indeed the Commission.
One of the things that your successor at PSC has said is that there is no dedicated resource. Now, I'm guessing there is resource. There's resource in Office of Human Resource, there's resource in the Cabinet Office, but what his Rob Collister's suggestion is that there's no actual dedicated resource to support the Commission. Is that correct?
It is actually correct, and it's one of the things that's highlighted in this report. Now, The Commission is a public body. It's not linked to any department. It doesn't have a budget. As a public body, it doesn't have any staff that are sort of station employers to service that Commission.
And yet it is the employer of 4,000 people.
It is the employer, so clearly changes and arrangements need to be made, because the Commission should be able to execute its functions as a board, if you like, with the appropriate secretariat support in a way that is unconflicted from the roles that it is also rightfully in a role to have oversight over and scrutinise, because there's key functions that are delegated away from the Commission. So we're talking, really about the CEO of the Isle of Man government and also the Office of Human Resources. So just in basic governance terms, any organisation shouldn't be solely reliant on the people that it's delegating away to in order to service its function. So there probably also will be other reasons for there just need to be a few changes to do with allocating resource, but it's in the best interest of outcome for the public that the Commission can play a role which is, taking almost like an audit oversight function, and that it can be much more able to prepare good, decent, useful, meaningful reports on a regular basis. I've obviously had to personally work on these, which I've been happy to do, but yes, usually there might be different arrangements. I wanted to remove the conflict, and all of this and the need for other governance considerations are also outlined in the report.
Glenn Faber and Peel MHK Kate Lord Brennan there. Garth MHK Daphne Kane spoke passionately in favour of government's net zero targets and budgets. You were the member that said, actually, we have a climate emergency and we need to do something about this. Were you happy with the way the debate went?
That debate or this debate? This debate, I think it's very fair. I think that there are opinions in the public, both on the island and further afield, sceptical about the climate change and the human impact in ever increasing temperatures. But I think it is apparent from a number of contributions in Tynwald that people in our community are feeling the impact of those climate changes, notably the floods in Laxey and elsewhere, and ever increasing intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. And it is very important that we have an awareness of that, acknowledge it, and do everything we can in our power not to contribute to the world emissions, I suppose, but also it's very apparent to me that we're not getting over the message publicly about the benefits of taking the climate action that we have signed up to. And it's not this huge expense that's being imposed on people. Actually, what has been achieved and was articulated by the DEFRA member in bringing in early on in the debate is the huge amount of funding that has been given, a couple of millions each, both to green living grants, making and enabling people to improve their properties, to have ever greater air tightness, to draft excluders, and hopefully with forthcoming schemes there'll be improvements in terms of people having better access to loans and grants to put in alternative heating systems. So there is a shift, and it is government's job to ensure that cultural shift. But as we know, change is hard, and if you win the hearts and minds, and then you can nudge people and encourage and support people to make the transition, that's what we need to do. And I suppose my biggest takeaway is we have to do a huge amount more on public engagement, both in communicating what we're doing, but why we're doing, and also just the benefits for everybody, from the peat restoration project that's ongoing, the blue carbon project, and right down to the improvements for individual people in individual lives, whether that's a reduction in pollution because we are switching over to renewable and increasing amounts, hopefully, of renewable energy within our energy, but also having an eye on our energy security and our food security. So reducing food miles and food waste, but making sure we use more local produce. It's all interconnected, and it's all business as usual, actually, across government. It's not a standalone thing. These are the appropriate and responsible, sustainable policies for the future of our island.
You mentioned there, I don't know, a handful of millions of pounds as a large amount of money, but there's 40,000 homes on the island, so that represents, £100 per household. That's not going to be enough to get people to shift, bearing in mind that many people live in homes that are constructed in such a fashion that it's quite difficult and expensive to get them properly insulated. Is government... the rhetoric seems to be serious, but the actual reality in terms of how you're going to persuade people to change seems very, very limited.
It is, and we have finite budget, and when there are the complaints, we must stop spending these millions on climate change and adaptations, we haven't spent enough. We're 30 years too late coming to the party. Trade allure indeed, but now we know all the evidence is there, the science is there, what's happening and is having an impact, and actually failing to make those proper investments now, it's going to cost us a lot more in the future.
But do you not think that if you were investing more people would be persuaded that this journey was the right way to go? They don't actually see that as being meaningful. Therefore, they look at all the other things that government does and say, well, you're spending all this money on these things. My energy bills are not going down.
There will be fresh schemes coming from DEFA, I believe, next year that hopefully will address that in terms of a renewable form of heating rather than an alternative source of heating rather than fossil fuel boilers. It has been addressed in terms of new builds from next year. Any new build will not have fossil fuel boilers, so people will have the benefit of cosier houses with lower heating bills and probably electric heating systems. In terms of the money spent, there have been grants and there have been an amount, and I don't have the latest figures, but there was the energy efficiency scheme that DEFA had, the Green Living Grant scheme that was run through DFE, the figures of the numbers who've applied for them, and it is in... I was going to say thousands, it's certainly a lot of hundreds of people who've benefited already. But actually everybody's benefiting, for instance, in the adaptations that the Department of Infrastructure has been taking in the flood works that have been ongoing in Laxey for the last 5 years. And I think the amount spent on that, and in the £42 million figure that's often quoted, at least 10 million of that was under DOI and flood mitigations. But when they roll the schemes out, even down to saying, seawalls that we are hopeful of getting in Laxey and raising the harbour wall levels to protect people from the worst impacts of the storms, as well as all the actions being taken higher up in the hills to say the peat restoration and the debris catcher that's up higher up in the Laxey River. All this feeds into a master plan, if you like, for protecting people, protecting homes, because there is real anxiety every time there's a bad forecast or a storm warning on the island, and it's part of the picture. Hopefully, increasingly, I think DFE will be addressing and making available business loans for green changes across businesses. That's coming, and also there will be, I think, an improved scheme responding to the issues that were in the previous scheme and addressing that and making more funding and loans available for people to go on this journey. And meanwhile, I believe Manx Utilities has also been rolling out significant numbers of air source heat pumps for people on an interest-free basis, and I've heard from colleagues who've been able to access that actually the £100 plus that it's costing them per month to pay off the interest-free loan to put in an air source heat pump is what they were paying in gas 5 years ago, and now significantly lower. So it is often the those who can afford it who are able to make the changes first, but absolutely we need to make sure that everybody comes on the journey with us, that nobody's left behind. That is what the Climate Action Plan includes. So it addresses all sectors that have to make reductions, and the target is 15%. But then we have the targets that are locked in for key periods, and that does depend on being able to decarbonise a significant portion of our energy generation. The reason it hasn't happened quickly enough, from what goes on in people's homes to the bigger infrastructure projects on the island, is that we came from such a late stage coming into it, that a lot of the work that's been done over the recent years has been meticulous research and investigation into exactly what are our options for energy generation, what does need to go into the mix. And DEFRA likewise has its energy security strategy, and those both have to join up, along with what we're doing to protect the island from flood and the improving our housing condition and reducing, nudging people to go over to electric vehicles and everything else, all actually have a benefit on our quality of life and on our finances too.
Garth MHK Daphne Kane there. So what do you think? Is climate change a threat to our current way of life and in need of urgent attention? And if it is government's response appropriate? Perhaps on this occasion, government has developed a perfect system to reach net zero which doesn't need a review. Certainly that was the view of Tynwald. And are you concerned at the suggestion that the Public Services Commission has no staff to service its work? Or perhaps this is just political game playing to secure extra support? Let me know your thoughts on the programme by contacting Phil Gorn at manxradio.com and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Myos on Geistachrom. Thanks for listening.